Hey everyone, welcome back. This is Will Talks Recording, and today we are talking about drum room mics. Now, room mics, as you probably know, are there to pick up the sound of the space an instrument is in, kind of more than the direct sound of the instrument itself. And you could record room mics on any instrument. People do, but for some reason you hear them talking about drum room mics a lot more than you hear them talking about vocal room mics or acoustic guitar room mics. So why is that? Well, to answer that question, we're going to have to get a little bit techie for a second, because drums are both very loud and also not very loud at all. Let me explain. Have a look at this session here. Here is like a full band kind of recording. We've got some vocals, we've got some bass, we've got some horns, things like that, and of course some drums. Check out what the waveforms look like, right? Here are some vocals here. Okay, there's kind of louder bits, there's kind of quieter bits, but like the difference between those isn't that big. More vocals. These are some horns. Very, very constant level on most of those. Here's some acoustic guitar, electric guitar, bass. And now check out the drums. Really, really peaky, right? There are two ways you think about loudness kind of in the audio world. One of those is the peak loudness. What's the individual, instantaneous, loudest part of this kind of sound? And the other is the average loudness over a kind of a short rolling window of time. Now, drums are really, really hot in terms of peak level, as you can see. They are really, really low in terms of average level. And that's a problem because what our ears use to perceive loudness is the average. So drums, even when you record them as loud as you possibly can, the average level is still quite quiet. And it can be a bit of a struggle sometimes to get your drums to feel really big and expansive, like alongside lots of other loud instruments. So often the game when you're recording drums is to try and counteract that as much as possible. You're trying to find any way that you can to up the average level of these drums and either reduce the peak or kind of just leave that where it was. There's lots of ways you can do that. You can compress, you can add saturation, but one of them is to record room mics. And that's because if you think about it, most of the time you're hearing drums, you're probably in a room or any other instrument. Part of what you hear is the direct sound from every drum hit. But a lot of what you hear actually is the sound, the reverberance of the space. A drum hit will bounce off the ceiling and come to you, bounce off that wall and come to you. And because the speed of sound is so slow, that means they arrive later than the direct hit, which always takes the shortest path to you. And that means that you basically hear every hit more than once. In fact, many, many, many times in quick succession. You get to experience that peak, that individual transient, lots of times. The average loudness increases. So is that it? Is that the only reason we record drum room mics? I mean, it's an important reason, but there's a bit more to it than that, as you might imagine. For one thing, recording room mics is really, really good to keep drums sounding natural because, as we just said, most of the time you're hearing instruments, you're in a space. You're so used to hearing the reverberance of somewhere contributing to your just experience of that sound that it's really weird not to have that. If you've ever been in an anechoic chamber, you'll know what I'm talking about. But you can kind of mock that up by just recording drums with loads of spot mics really close. If you record some drum room mics, it's also just a lot more similar to the experience you have of listening to things in real life. For some genres, that's all you need. The classic examples I keep bringing up are jazz and folk. Well, yeah, if you're trying to recreate the experience of just listening to a band, then that can be all. That can be it. But even that's not really the thing that excites a lot of engineers about drum rooms. Because once you've got a recording of drums where basically all the individual hits are kind of like smeared or lengthened over time, there's more audio to play with, which means you can start to do some really, really interesting things. Why don't we have a listen to start off with? So this is a song called Oh Boy by an artist called Max Runham. I recorded this with Max a couple of years ago now. Max is a really, really great guy. He has given me permission to play this to you kind of for free. He hasn't asked for anything in return. So I'm going to put a link to his EP down in the description. It's a really, really great piece of work. Go check it out. He's a lovely guy, great musician. He's definitely worth your time. So to start off, here are the drums just with no reverb, no room mics, no nothing. Okay, so far so good. Sounds like recorded drums. Check out what happens when I bring these rooms in. Again, these are unprocessed. There's no EQ, there's no nothing. These are just a couple of Omni mics kind of placed kind of middle distance from the kit. Without the rooms, it all just sounds quite tight, quite mono, really. You bring in those rooms, and although the panning of the individual things doesn't change, you just have this sense of there's stuff around, there's stuff in your stereo field. And it's a lot more like actually being there, looking at someone and listening to them playing drums in real life. So far, so good. What happens if we start to just try and increase the average level a bit more? What if we try and compress those room mics? Well, let's see. The aggression, like the energy that comes from just compressing these mics a bit. Should we take it further? Let's take it further. Let's see what happens. I mean, there's a few things happening there. One is it just feels really good when that's it, which is great. That's a good thing. That's worth it on its own. But we can probably get a bit more technical than that. Did you notice how things change so much depending on the release time of that compressor? When you're really, really fast, basically the sound just becomes one big constant block of volume, right? But there's loads more grit and distortion that basically comes from that. I think because the release is so fast that the compressor's trying to release before the hits are actually ready, and it's kind of chattering, going like, should I be compressing, should I not? You slow it down and things start pumping a lot more, and depending where that's set, it really kind of brings out certain things of the groove or not. There are a couple of settings there where like the hi-hat was being like knocked away by the kick at the kind of start of every bar, but then kind of coming back over the next couple of beats. So you're kind of like giving a bit of kind of dynamic variation to the hi-hat pattern. The faster your releases as well, you'll notice things like cymbals pumping a lot more. It's often things like kicks and snares which trigger the compression, and everything else gets knocked back as well. You can really hear it on that crash cymbal just there. If we slow down the compression a bit, it's still doing it, but because the release is slower, it's just less noticeable to us. So that's something to bear in mind as well. I mean, people actually sometimes record cymbals like as an overdub after the main drum take, basically for that reason. So you can get really creative with your compression and your distortion and things you're doing in the mix without having to worry about long sustained things like cymbals kind of like pumping too much. And you notice that like even when we have that quite quietly in the mix, it really, really does a noticeable thing to just make the drums feel really groovy. Yeah, it kind of just makes the groove feel a bit more 3D. Suddenly there's like this stuff happening kind of depth-wise. Hits are getting pushed away and coming back. And there's just something about like when you're pushing gear to its limits and it's like on the edge and really fighting you, that can feel really energetic and really kind of like gritty as well. I think this is why engineers love drum room mics so much, because like your contribution becomes really obvious. Like what's happening there with that compressor has got, like that was not happening in the room when the drummer performed. That's something that you're doing to enhance. And even if you're not doing something to kind of like improve the groove or the performance of the drums, like in a way that's very true to what's happening, you can still take like the thought, like the mood of what they were going for and the whole band was going for, and like just take that further. You can take that thought and run with it. So what mics and where to put them? I think I already said that like to record a natural sound, Omni mics are usually really, really good choice. If you want the most natural thing, well, it's just put mics not too far away from each other, maybe like a meter at most spaced, and at just head height, and walk around the room while the drummer's playing, find somewhere that sounds good and the kit kind of feels balanced, pop them there. But we don't have to just record things natural. You know, if we're going into this kind of compression and like over-processing almost of drum room mics, well, we're into very subjective territory more than like kind of objective truth of what happened in the room. And that means that kind of nothing is off the table. If you've got a favorite mic that sounds really weird and really characterful but takes compression really, really well, put that somewhere vibey. Like putting mics places that you would never ever put them otherwise, like jamming them right up against a wall or like behind something or like in a drum case or something like that. I've even known people plug in headphones into a DI and just leave those on the floor somewhere and basically treat your headphones like a microphone. And that sounded really, really cool. There's all sorts of things. The world is your oyster. Try dynamic mics, try directional mics, try Omni mics, try putting them inside the room, try opening the door and putting them outside the room. It's all to be played around with. Now, there are some things to maybe watch out for. If you're recording a room, you're into territory where like things like room modes, those are like frequency boosts and nulls, depending where you are in a room, really come into effect. So you might find you put a mic one place and the kick is like really too loud and things like the snares or one of the toms are really kind of like dipped. By the time you get into really, really compressing a signal, differences like that become really noticeable. So trying to find somewhere just like relatively neutral in terms of like frequency balance. You can find that out by just walking around the room and seeing kind of, or moving a mic around when you've got headphones on to hear it. Can be a really helpful thing to do. You often run into problems, or I did when I was starting out, with rooms that are kind of too small to give you much ambience to work with. There are some things you can do. That's a situation where you might definitely want to be using directional mics rather than omnis, because you can use the nulls of those directional mics where they're not sensitive at all to reject as much of the direct sound of the drums as possible and therefore maximize how much of the ambient sound you're getting. If you try all those things and there's still not quite enough ambience, you might just be in a position where that's kind of what you've got. Sometimes your hands are just kind of tied. So drum room mics, we're into like big picture, what's the vibe of the drums territory. We're also into very, very subjective choices territory. Often you'll be choosing a particular compressor or a particular pair of mics or a position in a room, not because it sounds a certain way, because it makes you feel a certain way. And if you can get that feeling to match with like the mood of the song, the kind of the intention of the production and the songwriting, then you're really onto something good. So have fun. I hope you really enjoy it. I hope this has been useful to you. Let me know how this goes if you use any of these tips and tricks in your kind of next recording session. I'll be seeing you very, very soon with another video. In the meantime, have a great session. Have a great day.